Hey everyone, welcome to YOLA National at Home and to our final episode for our Pathway Exploration series. My name is Angelica Cortez and I work with the LA Phil on YOLA. I'm joined by my colleague Emily Bourne, who at least on my screen is in this corner here. Emily is going to be moderating the chat. So if y'all have any questions for any of our panelists at any point, please feel free to use that. And please feel free to let us know where you're tuning in from, city, state, all that good stuff. It makes us feel good to see so many faces and familiar names from so many places. So I'm going to be moderating today's chat. So I want to introduce my incredible group of colleagues here, Dalanie Harris, Katie Brown, and Alex Lang. And just to give you a little bit of behind the scenes on why we're all here, basically we wanted to take a minute to talk about pathway explorations in music. Hopefully, if you've tuned into some of these other sessions, what you've seen is that there are a lot of career pathways in music. And more importantly, there's a lot of incredible people that are creating their own career pathways in music, right? So they're not just doing the traditional route, taking their instrument, playing music, and kind of going to win an audition, but actually they're instead making this place their own and taking the time to figure out what they want this space to be. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that today. You're also going to learn a little bit more about these threes pathways. So super excited about that. We'll talk about some of the themes that we heard over the past few sessions and some of the conversations that came up as we were discussing that. So just to start out, let's go ahead and hear a little bit about you three's pathways. I'm going to ask Katie to get us started. Tell us a little bit about your pathway. How did we get to where you are today?
Okay, hi everyone. My name is Katie. Oh, it says Catherine, huh? I go by Katie. I'm a violist from Evanston, Illinois, which is a suburb just outside of Chicago. I did my undergraduate studies at Illinois State University. And I got there just because I liked music. I kind of picked the viola to get out of math class in fourth grade and just stuck with it. And then was like, I guess I'll study music ed. And then I graduated from Illinois State and got more serious and was able to attend the Eastman School of Music, where I did my master's in viola performance and music education. In between that, I taught public school for like a couple months, and then I got into Eastman, and I was like, well. And then after Eastman, I took a break, and now I'm a orchestra fellow with the Memphis Symphony Orchestra. And yeah, that's it.
No big deal. Cool. Thanks, Katie. Let's go with Alex next.
Hey, my name is Alex Lang. I grew up in Silver Spring, Maryland, just outside DC. The school that I went to didn't actually have an instrumental music program, but I started with a summer program the DC Youth Orchestra ran, beginner group clarinet class. And then from there, my parents saw that there was something going on and found me a private teacher. And, that was music for me really through junior high, middle school, junior high, and high school was just clarinet lessons Thursday at 6:30. And those would get longer and bigger, and clarinet just became a more part of my life. And I, did some competitions. Didn't love that, did okay at that. Anyway, then went off, majored in music. I went to Northwestern University. What's up, Evanston? And actually withdrew from Northwestern after my third year. I knew I was coming back, but I needed a reset. And so I went to Amsterdam and studied with a teacher there and did an artist certificate actually before I finished my undergraduate. And then came back, had things back on track, finished my undergraduate, and then graduate school, orchestral performance, blah, blah, blah. Went out on the circuit, started taking auditions, was fortunate to get a fellowship with the Detroit Symphony. So that gave me a place to practice while I was taking all those auditions. And then eventually landed in the Phoenix Symphony, where I now have been for the last 20 years. And I like to say that I have a practice, and my job with the Phoenix Symphony is a big part of my practice. But my practice is about the way I see music, and I see music as being about sound and words and people. And I try to have a practice that really expresses itself in all three of those ways.
Thanks, Alex. Let's hear from Dalanie, and then I have questions about that practice. I want to hear from Dalanie first about her pathway.
So my name is Dalanie. I'm a bass player. I started playing piano first in church, and then I started playing the bass in YOLA. I'm from Inglewood, California, which is in LA. But yeah, I started playing the bass. I played a couple other instruments in high school, the flute, the bassoon, just because. But then I got serious about playing the bass, so I went to Eastman School of Music in Rochester, New York. Well, it's not where I met Katie, it's where I should have met Katie, but we met in that same time period, I would say. And actually, after my junior year at Eastman, I didn't know what I was doing, and like everything was just getting to me, the culture shock of coming from a place that's predominantly Black to a place that's overwhelmingly white, and like the rigor of conservatory, all of that was just really getting to me, especially because Eastman is a pretty academic conservatory. So it's very academic, like academia heavy, in addition to being performance heavy. So after my junior year, I got an internship working at the LA Phil, and then I decided I wasn't going to go back to school, and so I took a semester off. That would have been my senior year, and I continued to work there. So I kind of got to do other things other than play the bass, which is what I've been doing for so long, and almost had me thinking I couldn't do anything else. And so, I took that semester off, and then I went back to finish up my senior year, the spring semester, and then a pandemic happened. So that's my pathway up until that. Oh, and then Katie and I started Classically Black. Sorry,
I didn't mention Classically Black.
I was gonna say.
It's on it says Katie Brown, Dalanie Harris, Classically Black podcast. In 2018, I knew I was forgetting something. In 2018, Katie and I started Classically Black podcast, which is a show that kind of merges Black culture and classical music, and highlighting Black musicians, composers, and their contributions to classical.
And can you, Dalanie and Katie, tell us a little bit more about why you created that space? What brought you to create that space? Why did you go about the trouble of, like, what are we at? We talk about almost being at 100 podcast episodes now. You're like 80 in. Why? Like, to what end?
I think we first, because a podcast like came into my mind as one of my practice ideas. Like sometimes my mind drifts while I'm practicing, and so I get my best ideas. So I was like, oh, we should start a podcast, because I was pretty new to listening to podcasts, probably like about a year, and Dalanie and I listened to some of the same podcasts, well, just one of the same podcasts. So we had that. I can't speak for Dalanie, but I don't think we foresaw Classically Black becoming like this. We were like, oh, we should like talk about classical music, because that's how Dalanie and I speak about classical music anyway. Like we will always just talk about it like, oh, that slaps, just like in regular conversation. So we would like just put it on the mics, and then it kind of I would say like it became this community of like highlighting the Black experience in classical music and really diving deep into like our quarrels with the field and the struggles of being Black in this field. So I don't know, Dalanie, you can say I don't have distinct memory of being like, we got to start this thing to like whatever, but it really developed. I'm really happy that it kind of developed into this advocacy for not only sharing Black music, but saying Black people are here. And we went into it with that. We wanted to say that Black people are in classical music, but it really developed and grew into what it is today.
Yeah, I think it was born out of like Black. That's why I said Eastman is not where I met Katie, it's where I should have met Katie, because we went to Eastman together for a year and a half before we actually met in the airport in Detroit at a conference. So we have been on the same plane there, and she was like, you go to Eastman? I was like, yeah. You go to Eastman? Yeah. And then we became like friends really, really quickly, and we're like, why didn't we know each other? Because we didn't have a Black Students Union, we didn't have anything like that. So we were like, okay, we're gonna, a couple months later, literally no one believes us, but we knew each other for like 6 months before we started Classically Black. And so we were like, yeah, we're just gonna we're just gonna do this.
Thank you. And I want to circle back to Alex, because Alex, a couple times throughout the sessions, you talked about so-called classical music, right? Or I saw you putting quotes around classical music. You talk about why that is and how that kind of connects to what Dalanie and Katie are speaking.
Yeah, I mean, so I think language is important. I think that the frame of classicality is often obscures or is a beard for white supremacy. And so this notion that this music is, the idea of the classical, right, is this, it's the ideas behind it are like things that are beyond space and time and place and are timeless. And so I think that tends to lend itself to a narrative that like this music is universal and doesn't have any sort of affiliations to culture or place or time, which I think really for myself as a Black artist, I absorbed a lot of that and reiterated a lot of that, and then didn't really have a place for the sense of alienation I felt within the art form, alienation from myself, alienation from the people I associated with or was trying to associate with, alienation from, a sense of Black cultural affirmation. And so I say so-called, I did all kinds of different stuff along the way, right? So this is about pathways. So at first I would say stuff like Western European art music, or I would say things to people like, what are you talking about? And I'd be like, classical music. And they'd be like, oh, well then, but I didn't want to keep co-signing on this narrative. I didn't think it was healthy for me, and I wanted to call it out. So I eventually came upon so-called classical music, which sort of is, I just say it, it's just how I think of it now. And it lets me, people can stop and ask like, well, why do you say so-called? And we can talk about it, or we can just keep moving, because I don't want to spend a whole day on that. And I don't often, what I need to identify is we're talking about this right here, right? So what's important is that we agree about what we're talking about. So saying so-called allows me to sort of name it, also not contribute to frames and ideas that I think I don't want to contribute to anymore, but also lets people understand what I'm talking about. So so-called classical music.
Yeah, that makes me think a lot about when we just got done with our first year of the YOLA National Institute. And when we were doing interviews for that, there was a lot of language from the young folks who are interviewing for the program about how music is a universal language, right? And yeah, that was the exact face that I made, Dalanie, where it's like, well, I don't know, when I'm at home, like, the salsa and Celia Cruz are not quite the same language as getting on stage and getting ready to play Beethoven, right? Which I think leads us into the next part of our conversation, which is about this idea of like competing or coexisting, or these different truths that we exist within. And so can you all talk a little bit about the sort of tensions that come up both as so-called classical musicians, right, as folks who are in the field of so-called classical music, but also that are trying to deconstruct what that art form is. Dalanie, for some reason your mic went out. I know that this has happened with us before. Not yet.
What about now?
Now we got it.
Okay. Something that came to mind when you were talking about like music being a universal language, and Alex also said like some people say, well, music kind of like transcends that. It's not really about that political, that whatever. Like, I'm a firm believer that music, like we should be open to music being for fun. I feel like as classical musicians, so-called classical musicians, and just people that play music for a living, we get really bogged down in like the, like it's very tedious because you're trying to make it perfect. You want to win an audition or, whatever the case may be. So it's really hard for us to grasp the fact that some people play music for fun, but on the other hand, those who are in this field who say it's not political and it transcends that, that's just simply not true. Like, I feel like anyone who has taken a basic music history class will know, like, classical music has been incredibly political for a very, very long time. Like, Beethoven was political, Shostakovich was political, like, and it's just, that's kind of the same thing with those like competing truths. Like some people feel as though they can't enjoy music. They feel like, oh, you're trying to take that away from us because you're trying to make it into something that it's not. But also, it is that. Like, so I don't know. That's something that I feel like is that's something that a lot of musicians and lovers of the art form are like grappling with right now. Some people are refusing to acknowledge the fact that the other side exists as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think on the whole, music is universal thing. The idea that, or the phrase that just jumped into my head was like someone saying language is universal. I mean, sure, yeah, language is universal among human beings. I don't know if that's actually the universe, but in any case, I get the idea. But we would never say that, like, because you speak one language, you can speak another language, or that language that, right? I mean, so yeah, music is universal in the way language. But here's the thing. You rarely hear other types of artists or art forms saying the universal thing, right? That's actually a pretty germane, pretty home to so-called classical music. And what we mean to say is that this music is universal, which is what the notion of classicality sort of brings to mind. But to your point, Angelica, I thought what was really interesting in especially listening to the conversations that Katie and Dalanie had was this sort of tension between practicing self-care and practicing scales, or practicing self-care and practicing so-called classical music. And I was really, I thought the conversations Dalanie and Katie had really brought out a lot of that. I was really interested in what a lot of their panelists were saying about, trying to navigate these tensions between, like, I want to be great at this thing, I love this thing, I'm into this thing. I also sometimes feel abused by this thing. I feel not loved by it back. I feel like it tells me to deny, like, aspects of myself. I feel so. I'm curious, Dalanie and Katie, like, what type of stuff I'm also curious, because you're a little bit younger than me. Like, how is your generation sort of, or the generation even behind you, like, how do you see them, navigating this or balancing this or expressing this sort of tension between, like, practice self-care and practice scales till your fingers bleed? And, how does that show up for y'all or the people you're talking to?
Well, I don't know. For me, I'm always, how do I say this? Delaney and I talk a lot about taking breaks. Like, that's something that I've always championed, mainly because it's not, I really like doing nothing because I never get to do that. But I like taking breaks because viola is it's a mental thing for me. Mainly, and I think it's interesting, like, that music is a universal thing. I wanted to say that, like, that's the first thing. The curriculum hopefully has changed, but, like, in my intro to music ed class in undergrad, one of the first things you do is learn how to advocate for music education, because it's the first thing they cut, and they'll be like, well, music is universal. So you kind of like carry that with you. Like, that's one of the first things. I see the paper in my head with my professor's name on it, like, music is universal. Number one, keep music, so but the tension between, like, so-called classical music and, like, my own experience is very, I really compartmentalize a lot of things in my mind, because they don't really exist at the same time for me. It's really weird. Like, a lot of times, like, my pastor will ask me to play at church, and I'll be like, why? It'll be boring. It's just hymns and stuff, like, because I don't really do a good job of, like, combining those. Because one thing I do with mental health and viola, which I don't know, I wouldn't recommend anybody else do this, but I did pretty okay. I've done pretty okay. I heard Missy Copeland say something that really struck a chord with me, and it was how, like, when she leaves the ballet studio, ballet is done. She don't watch people dance. She don't think about ballet. She leaves the studio, and, like, that's it. So I really incorporated that into my personal playing, and I just saw a huge difference about like, I'm going to practice for these 6 hours, and then I don't think about viola anymore, because especially like the shift in going to a state school, which was pretty rigorous, because my undergraduate teacher made it rigorous, to going to Eastman where everything was operating at 700 cylinders. Like, why was music theory so hard? But at Eastman, that really helped me, because it was like, viola is something that I do, but it's not the only part. It's part of who I am, but it's not who I am. So like, that's how I kind of navigate mental health. I take breaks. Like, I'm on a break right now, but I have to get back in shape. It's when I go to Memphis, so that's coming up. But I'm on a break right now, and also like, I try to compartmentalize. Like, I like listening to viola music sometimes, but like, I'm probably listening to The Baby or Hezekiah Walker or Flo Milli. Like, I'm listening to anything but Rostropovich played the Bach cello suites, because that's just how I navigate my mental health in this field.
Well, I think yeah, our generation has been better about mental health and self-care and incorporating that into whatever they do. I would say that I'm terrible at that, and I have been for a very long time, because that's just kind of the culture of like the field. It's, you're always trying to get better. You're always trying to, I don't know, like improve and take criticism and all that kind of stuff. So I but because of that, because of how terrible I've been at it, I can't stress it enough, because I truly feel like my relationship with the instrument has suffered because of that, because of not having a healthy boundaries, healthy expectations. Like, I cannot stress it enough. Like, yeah, if you need a break, you have to be honest with yourself about that. And it's hard, because you're not just dealing with your own expectations. You have a teacher, you have a studio, you have other people to answer to. But I'm trying to get better about that. And like Katie said, yeah, we talked about taking breaks, and I'm getting to a point where I don't feel bad if I'm taking a break, as long as it's not like, you just, you show up to your lesson without the instrument and you just like,
I'm on a break, so
right. Like, this
what we doing today?
I look like that gift of P. Diddy looking at that guy and they're just staring at each other like, what next? Like, it's not like that, but it's the balance, because like, I remember there being a point where I'm like, I feel like I'll never touch the bass again, and people don't talk about that in classical music. And I've told, like, I'm putting my business out there, but whatever. It's I put this on the show, talking about a break that I took where I couldn't even take the bass out of the case. Like, and I had to have a moment with the instrument where I just was like, I had to consciously acknowledge the good times that I had with it, because they seemed so far away. Like, I was so deep in that anxiety where, like, I was like, don't nobody even say the word bass around me. Like, I don't want to talk about it. Like,
Basement.
Yeah, like, nobody even say, and it really got to that point, and that's why why this subject is like so important to me, is because like it sucks, something that you've been doing for a very, very long time, and you think this is my future, and then you kind of reach this point where you're like, I don't even know if I'm going to be able to do this anymore, because I ignored all the signs. I didn't take breaks. I didn't listen to my body and my mind when it said, like, you're being too hard on yourself, that sort of thing.
I'm a couple of things come to mind for me, especially around this pathways thing. I mean, I think one thing, so if there's any music educators or anyone running a conservatory out there or a school of music, I feel like I definitely would have benefited, and to the young people listening, like, no one taught me how to practice, right? And no one knew what I was doing in my practice sessions. And no one knew, to your point, Dalanie, like how I was talking to myself. And so you can get into some really destructive habits from a physical perspective, from a mental health perspective. There's a book, when I finish, I'll see if it's on the shelf behind me. I usually keep it there. But it's called First Learn to Practice, and I'll get the title in a second. But one of the first lessons, and I just read this book for the first time like 2 years ago, but it said, if you're not having fun in your practice sessions, the lesson is, if you're not having fun in your practice sessions, change them until you are. And that was really like, I know it sounds simple, that was really eye-opening for me, the idea that like, I should be, and so I've really tried to incorporate that as best I can, and think about like, how can I have a job, I get paid to practice, right? So I have obligations I have to meet, but how can I make my practicing more fun? What does that look like for me? Yeah, so I think on this question of like, you know, coexisting or competing truths, Angelica, where we started on this, I mean, I think that, you know, I look at like, the reason I say sounds, words, and people is because I was trying to articulate or encapsulate like all of these things. I didn't want the truths to be competing, right? I didn't want sort of Blackness and so-called classical music to be in competition with each other, because they don't feel like they're in competition within me necessarily. Sometimes perhaps, but it's more my experience of the both of them that cause some competition or some friction. And to be clear, friction isn't a bad thing. Like, I feel like my practice has benefited. We have classically Black because of friction, right? So friction isn't on its own necessarily a bad thing. It can lead to some interesting things. It can make fire. But I think that coming up with a framework that holds all of it, sounds, words, and people, and wanting to participate in all of them, help for me was about sort of trying to reconcile that competition, right? So I say so-called classical music because calling it classical music perpetuated narratives and frameworks that I felt were not censoring me, or were alienating to me. And I realized, I want to participate in all these things. And I think the nature of orchestral music is a lot of being subject to, right? That's sort of the what you're signing up for. You're subject to someone else's composition, subject to someone else's tempos, subject to the sort of collective. It's a beautiful thing, this idea of subsuming yourself and giving yourself over to the whole thing. But it can also, what I found was that there was a lot that I was sort of agreeing to that I didn't agree with. And there was a lot that I wanted to participate in, like, well, what does this music mean? And for whom is it for? And who are these spaces allegiant to? And so for me, you know, reconciling those competing or coexisting truths has been really productive, actually. And I look at what Dalanie and Katie are doing, and I see that as well. And your guests that you had on your last session, I felt like all of their projects, right? So Amari and Jasmine and Joey, and did I pronounce Amari's? Is that, I just saw it. Yeah. Like, I felt like their projects were like amazing sort of manifestations of them, you know, reconciling competing truths, and shout out to Nicole in Washington. We're like tossing around competing truths everywhere and not naming it. That's who first introduced. So, and Nicolian's on faculty for YNF. So anyway, so yeah.
And Alex, I think, you know, when you're talking about audience, right? You mentioned educators or young musicians. I think the other like big piece of the audience who we're talking to here is orchestras, right? Because orchestras valorize this sort of like, I'm going to give every ounce of me over to this thing. And I mean, Dalanie and I have worked together in an office setting. It's really interesting hearing you talk about like your mental health, because it was definitely, I think you were one of the first people to be like, yeah, Jell is always on the clock, right? Like, and I was like, oh shoot, like, yeah, Jell's always on the clock. Like, I should probably take a look at that and go ahead and like balance some of that out, right? I'm like, okay. All right. Yeah, I think that to your point, bringing some of this conversation in and starting to question like our own participation in that, competing truth is really important. So let's go ahead and talk about some of the highlights for all of you in these past couple sessions. What were some of the things that stuck out to you? What were some of the things that like made you think, you know?
I think one of the highlights was definitely hearing your conversation, Alex, with Garrett, because Garrett is somebody that like I stan, love him, like everything that he touches is gold. So I'm like big fan. And I also think that, I mean, his pathway, you know, that you guys talked about is just so, it's like is very interesting and unique, because he got to where a lot of musicians think that they are going and will just be, you know, like he won a job. And I just remember him saying that like one of the lowest points in his career was realizing that his orchestra job was not enough. And I just feel like that, I mean, I could only imagine, because, you know, there was a period of time where that's, you know, what I wanted, and to know that you've worked so hard for that, and it's not enough for whatever reason, whether that be financially or you're not artistically fulfilled, like, it was great to hear somebody actually be honest about that and say that. But it was also great to see how he kind of transformed his career, and like how that transition happened. And I mean, I'm very familiar with Garrett's work now, but just to see like he the stuff that he does with Triloquy, and how creative he's gotten with challenging what classical music is, what studying classical music looks like, has been really interesting. That's one of the highlights, was seeing his interview.
I really enjoyed Monica's interview. I also stand Monica. I stand Garrett too, but like Monica is just a goddess, and I've tapped into like an entrepreneurial mindset over the past couple of years, which has been a shift for me, because if you've met me anytime, anywhere over the past 3 years, I say I want to be in the Met. That's what I want to do. I love opera, and that hasn't gone away. But there's other things I wish to contribute to the world of classical music. And I just like that kind of talk about like how Imani Wynn started, and just hearing like the backstory of that kind of stuff, because a lot of people don't talk about that. And then I also liked how she said that Imani Wynn doesn't just come up overnight, you know, and because you kind of think like, oh, you want to do a thing? You want to do a thing? Period. We do a thing. And it's not always like that. So that was really interesting to me. And yeah, like the business stuff, like they don't teach you that kind of stuff. They might do a little bit if you elect to learn that kind of stuff in conservatory. However, like that was just really interesting for me. That was certainly one of my highlights.
Yeah, I think a highlight for me, and forgive me, the young brother who is a student at Morehouse. Kenneth, yeah. I thought his whole story was just really inspiring and fascinating and interesting. I feel like we don't talk enough about HBCUs and how, you know, that can really, I think, in many ways could be the key to the riddle, in terms of like, how do you make classical music, so-called classical music, relevant to Black, practice it in Black spaces, right? And so this idea that, you know, he would you know, be at Morehouse, and the way it was just really interesting and exciting for me. I'm hoping that we'll start to hear more of that. It was also interesting because there's a lot of talk about like pathways and money being invested, and, you know, projects in cities all over the country to try to get kids to go to like the Cleveland Institute of Music in Eastman, and because we're a pipeline to orchestras. And it's like, well, maybe that's not where it's at. And maybe that's not the healthiest thing for these young students, which is not to say if you want to go to Juilliard. I mean, look, I was all about it, you know, so I'm not trying to discourage anyone. I'm just saying, I thought that was a really inspiring and interesting story. So I really enjoyed hearing what he had to say. I really liked what Joey Guidry, is that Guidry? Yeah. I mean, the whole thing about, you know, Doc Martens and beanies and new music like not being, by virtue of it, this idea that like just because new music is sort of seen as other against the backdrop of like so-called classical music doesn't mean that it is any different as it relates to the centering of white people and white experiences, and the decentralization of Black people and Black experiences. And so his whole you know, sort of exposition on that, I thought was just really, really great. And I think overall, I mean, I'm almost 50 years old, and I think for me, I was really excited and inspired to see like how the generation that you, Katie, and Dalanie represent, and maybe a little bit younger with some of the people you were talking to, how connected you are, how you knew each other already. You know, that didn't start coming online for me until really my, you know, early early mid-20s when I went to Gateways for the first time, and another Laconia, Washington reference, because that's when Laconia and I met. We've been lifelong friends since. But this idea of like, a big thing for me in undergraduate and graduate was like the separation between like my life and self and like my musical life and self. And they were both like central to me, but they had very different expressions out in the world. And so the idea that like, I'm seeing a group of young Black people who define themselves around that, but also so-called classical music and the way everyone was vibing. I was just really excited and inspired, and like, can't wait, you know, to see what it's all going to look like. And can I join that orchestra when you guys start it?
Yeah, I really resonate with that, because like you really go through classical music. I'm not, obviously not everyone, but I went through a lot of classical music thinking I was the only one. You know, I went to a state school, so while the Black population at my state school was pretty big, you know, whatever BSU and Greek life and whatever it was, I was in the school of music. So I was one out of a 400 school. I was one of like 3 or 4 people. So it was everything was so separate for me. So when I got to Eastman, and then I saw like all these Black people, I was like, oh, this is great. And then, but there wasn't really a community. I was like, oh, so we doing this again.
And all these is relative, because
Yeah, that's true.
I mean,
That's true.
going from 3 to 20,
Yeah.
I was like, oh, it's a party. You
Yeah,
know?
fair enough.
You know, yeah, but it was still really like this junk where people were really kind of separate, and I was like, oh, this kind of sucks, but I mean, I'm used to this, so I guess what we're doing. And then I went to Gateways, and I was like, so there's a lot of Black people doing this, like a lot, and they're good. I was like, oh, okay, so let's figure out what we got to do. And that's when I think I didn't start anything, but I was more forthcoming. Like I saw Jasmine in orchestra. I was like, hi, my name's Katie. We should be friends. You're Black, I'm Black. Let's make sushi. Let's do something. And then, so that community, like, and then with Classically Black and like with Dalanie and stuff like that, it just feels, classical music feels comfortable to me for the first time ever, because like this, like I have people here that are doing this thing with me, like where we have made ourselves learn about Black composers, and they're doing this, and having like across the nation, I know people, and we have the community with Classically Black. Like I feel really, really comfortable here in a way that I never felt before until this Gateways post Classically Black time. So it is really, really exciting, and I hope that this energy of like Black community continues in classical music, because it just feels a lot better to be in a community, in a place that has been constructed to be predominantly or overwhelmingly, as Dalanie said earlier, white. You know, like we can exist in that space and feel really comfortable. And like this is the most excited I've been about classical music since I started when I was 9. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, on that, I think that what has made me also think about riffing on the fellowship that I saw online, how inspiring and exciting that was for me. And the fellowship I feel when I go to Gateways, I'm actually, you know, I'm on the board of Gateways, so big up for the Gateways Music Festival. Go check it out. You can go see our website, Facebook page, all that stuff. So just to define for the audience, actually, so Gateways is a music festival dedicated to classical musicians of African descent. So the connection, the upliftment, the inspiration of that group of practitioners. We draw people from all over the country and all over the planet to a gathering or a week-long festival of music making and laughing and fun and upliftment. In any case, I think that what that whole thing showed for me, and what I saw, and there's like, this is a social art form, right? Like that's part of what's happening, right? People, that's what's happening all the time. We're not adding something different to it. Actually, we're finding each other and finding a way to sort of express and inhabit the art form the way it's expressed and inhabited, like all over the place, right? So that, I mean, I just think it's important to note that, right? This isn't about like adding some extra element. It's about actually restoring something that hasn't been in our experience, and deepening our love for the art form, ourselves, each other. It's so anyway, yeah, it was, anyway, that was one of the highlights for me, was seeing that group of friends. It was great.
Yeah, and I think some of what y'all are pointing to is like this idea. I'm going to use the term like entrepreneurialism, but like I don't know that that's even the right term, because what each of you has talked about doing, and what each of the folks that have been on these panels have talked about, is essentially like, you know, this space wasn't quite mine yet, and I thought this particular thing was important, so I just went down that path and I did it. I guess for the young folks that are listening, that are like, you know, maybe I want a career in so-called classical music, because now they're all questioning what classical music even is. What advice do you have for them? Like, how did you all go about that? Because you're at this point, you two have Classically Black podcasts, and it's this incredible space that a lot of folks feel ownership over, right? And that you two feel ownership over. I would imagine that it didn't always feel that way, or that you weren't always quite sure, you know, how to really embrace some of that. What were the steps that you took to really make this space your own? Was it scary? Was it hard? What did you have to push past?
It was, I mean, yeah, you kind of have to work, I wouldn't say against, but like, it's kind of strange to work around the expectations of, you know, just the field. Like, I think I said this in one of the previous sessions, like, I've definitely, you know, been to those lessons where your teacher's just like, oh, so new episode this week, how long did that take? You know? And it's like, all right, so let's hear the XYZ. And it's just like, oh gosh, you know, like, just told him I spent 3.5 hours on this podcast, and now I played a wrong note. Let's see what happens, you know? So I think that was something that I kind of had to like work around, but just knowing that what I'm doing with Classically Black enriches my classical music experience and education. Like, it's not just something that I'm tacking on because I like working so much, because Classically Black is work. It's fun, but it's work. So yeah.
Yeah, going off of that, like, getting Classically Black off the ground was hilarious, because we've never podcast before. So we had, the idea was the easy part. Like, oh, we should have a podcast? Okay, that was like the easiest part of this whole thing. But like getting listeners and consistency, Dalanie and I are very much like, this must come out on Mondays. Like, they're hell or high water, it will come out on Mondays. We've lost episodes and recorded them 2 a.m. Like, we've got it up and edited to put it out at 5 a.m. Like, it must come out no matter what. But you're also in school at the same time, so that makes it incredibly difficult. Also, figuring out how to make a podcast. I mean, we watched a YouTube video till it was time to put it up, and then Dalanie were like, we couldn't figure out the RSS link, which is basically like a unique link that you post so that this goes out to all platforms. So like we host on SoundCloud, but it goes Spotify, Apple, whatever. But we couldn't figure out how to do that. So Dalanie and I were like, oh, we could just code real quick, right? So we looked like, we'll just build this thing. And
we looked up a 15-minute YouTube video on how to code. I'm like, people go to school for this. Like, we thought we were gonna learn how to do it.
Like, literally, like, how to code. And it was literally, I wish I was lying, it was like 12 o'clock in the morning. And I was like, okay, I'm gonna go lie down, because I'm not going, we were at my apartment, I'm like, I'm gonna go lie down, and we could try this again.
Don't care, doesn't matter anymore. It's 2 a.m. We have an episode due.
Like, that's my favorite part of the origins of Classically Black. So it's difficult. I think the main thing, but I think why, I mean, there are plenty of people who do podcasts every week. Like, that's the nature of podcasting. But one thing, I will say, like, my so-called classical music training prepared me to be successful at podcasting, because one thing is, people listen to us because even though we joke around everything's a joke. Like, we talked about Mahler last week and called it entanglement. Like, every single thing is a joke with us. But like, because we know classical music, or so-called classical music, and we're good at our instruments, people wouldn't listen to us if that wasn't the case. And that's how classical music is. Like, people wouldn't listen to Garrett if he wasn't good at the bassoon. Like, no one would really, and that kind of, it can be elitist, but I think that's true with everything. Like, would you go to Bobby Flay's restaurant if he wasn't Bobby Flay? Like, probably not. You know, like, he has a name for a reason. So we know our craft really well. And I think whatever path people go down with classical music, I think it's really important to be good at your instrument. Like, I was talking to some what's it called, teacher candidates last week, and they were like, you have any advice? I'm like, be good at your instrument, you know. And I mean, not just like I can play every Paganini Caprice backwards and forwards, but like just like being good at it, you know, whatever that means to you and your expectations and your mental health and whatever. But also classical music helped with consistency. Like I said, like there is not a Monday that comes that you won't see an episode. Even when we lost one and then we have to do it again, you know, that always happens. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think definitely in terms of advice and how to do it, right? So I think one thing is like friction isn't a bad thing. Like pay attention to it. There might really be a kernel of something there. The friction you're feeling around whatever it might be, some tension, I would look at it for sure. One, it might be that like it's telling you to slow down or stop or do something different or change your body if it's a physical thing. But if it's more of a intellectual or mental or spiritual one, like there might be something there, or resolving that might require you to build something amazing that would be interesting to you and other people and could be an area of practice for you for a long time. I think of yourself as building a practice, and a job is definitely a key component to that, right? I mean, I think one of the things I love most about my job is that I get paid to practice. I mean, usually right now things are a little different for performing musicians, but assuming that, you know, we make it through this and there's something to return to, which I'm pretty confident there will be. But even without that, I've been doing virtual stuff. So, I mean, so I think a job is an important part of a practice, and it's fundamental actually in many ways, because practicing takes time, the literal practicing, but also this sort of more capital P practice, which we talk about in the YOLA National Institute, right? So the expression of the thing, the meaning of the thing, your sort of work, your artistic practice. I think nuts and bolts, I definitely co-sign on the idea that like, if you like where is your authority going to come from? So if your authority is going to come from, or the authority you want to have just because you want to climb that mountain, or you love the viola or the bassoon or the clarinet or whatever, if that's going to be the source of your standing and authority in the business, then you really do have to be good, right? You don't necessarily have to be the best in the world to ever breathe or play, but you really do have to play in a way that both the collected field of professionals sort of, or forget about professionals, but the collected field respects and acknowledges like, yeah, that's the thing. But also you think about, you know, lay people or the audience, right? They come to see us do things with our bodies that they can't do. In the same way that I go to Cirque du Soleil, like I have a body, but I can't do any of that stuff. It's fascinating to me. Show me more. And I think there's a similar sort of thing happening inside concert halls, right? People come to see the human coordination show, that, right? They want to see stuff like that, people achieving a level of consistency and accuracy and manipulation of their nervous system that's like fascinating and interesting, and, you know, not unlike a hyperflexible person twisting themselves into knots, right? It's like, I got 2 arms and 2 legs, and like I didn't even know they could do that. So I do think this idea of like shedding and getting as good as, to the degree that you want your authority to come from that. I will say though that like that's not the only place authority comes in the field of music, be it so-called classical music or otherwise, right? Like Berry Gordy is responsible for the Motown sound, and everybody knows who that is. And I couldn't tell you what instrument he played or if he can hold a tune. I imagine he could at some point. In our field, you know, a lot of people know the name Deborah Borda. I couldn't tell you what instrument Deborah Borda plays, but I can tell you that, you know, when she speaks, the field listens, and when she wants something to happen in the field, it happens. So, you know, I think there's a lot of different ways to go about that. But if you are choosing to make sound making your sort of authority, or that, then definitely you have to put in the time on that. And then I will say on that, in terms of self-care, this is the book that I was talking about. So it's called First Learn to Practice. It's by Tom Haney. It's really thin. It's 7 ideas and 7 habits. I don't know if it's still in print anymore, But this first one I think is key, which is to say practicing needs to be fun, not just should be fun, it needs to be fun if you're going to be doing it like for the long haul or even for the short haul. So empower yourself if your practicing isn't fun to change it until it is.
I feel like you already kind of covered this, but I always enjoyed, Alex, you at the end of every session asked everyone to kind of give one final piece for young folks who are listening, who are interested in music and interested in pursuing a career. Just one thing. If you were to tell them one thing, what would that be? Just as we wrap up here, our final pathways session.
I would say it's okay to change your mind. So I went to undergrad as music ed, but was also with the hopes of becoming a dentist. I was taking pre-dental courses. So I took like all the way up through orgo, and then I was like, this ain't it. And then I was like, okay, I'm gonna be a classroom teacher. When I taught 6 to 12 high school orchestra, I felt really unfulfilled. Like the kids were great, I was having a good time, but I was like, this can't be it. Then I went to Eastman and I was like, okay, well, I'm going to be an orchestral musician. And I'm still kind of there. You know, I'm not going to tell all my business for the world, but I'm still basically there, but I want to do other things on top of that orchestral path. And so you might say like, oh, you just sound like you are having a midlife crisis. I'm not, but it's okay to change your mind. You go towards something and then you refine that and you keep going and you refine that and you refine that and you refine that. So I would say like, it's okay to change your mind.
Yeah, sorry, Dalanie.
I don't know.
Yeah, you're good.
No, but I was like, you're a bit young for a midlife crisis, Katie.
Okay, I'm in quarter life crisis, but I already said it, so it was.
But no, I would say, I guess like do other things, and I don't mean that as in like have a backup plan in case you fail. Like I'm not saying not like that, but like an instrument is not a personality. Like it's not, you know, and you know, classically Black can be a thing because Katie and I are into like we embrace our culture and like we do other things, and that's why we're able to relate it to classical music. You know, you're relating if you're not doing anything but playing your instrument, you're relating what Mozart to Beethoven. Like, you know, we related what Young and May to Schubert. Like, you know, like we're doing other things, and it just helps you stay sane. Like before Classically Black, Katie and I barely ever talked about classical music. Like I went on an errand with her to pick up her viola from the luthier, and she still was playing it, and I was like, Katie plays a viola? Like for a split second, I was like, like we go to the Eastman School of Music. Every time I see her, she has the viola on her back. But for some like we just never talked about music. So she started playing. I was like, wow, she really sounds good. Like what's going on? But she's literally getting a master's degree in viola performance from the Eastman School of Music. Of course she sounded good. Like so I just yeah, I would say do other things. And also because if you do choose, you know, to leave the non-traditional path of conservatory, freelance orchestra, whatever, you can feel more secure in that. Because also in this day and age as a musician, you need to know how to do other things. You need to know how to write well, to market. You need to know how to do that anyway, whether you're going to be a musician or not. And there was like a period of time where I thought I kind of had to, you know, be on that path, because I was like, I've been playing the bass for so long, I can't do anything else. Like, and I really, really thought that, you know, and I was like 17, like, you know, my life is, I got to do this for the rest of my life. Like, that's so ridiculous. But yeah, that would be my advice.
That's great. My advice would be to embrace the power of these 3 words, which are I don't know. right? So I think that the way that shows up would be one, practice a lot slower because you don't know, right? Be okay with that, right? I think if I could look back, if there was one like hands-on practical thing, everybody should be practicing a lot slower and understanding why it's important to practice slower. And part of that is about being curious about what you don't know, as opposed to trying to obliterate what you don't know. So-called classical music, I think, is all about the knowing, right? I know all the notes, and it's all about sort of obscuring what you don't know, right? Trying to, play a no perfect thing. So I would lean into the power of I don't know, lean into how liberating it is to say it out loud, to be like, yeah, I don't know. It also, I think, inclines you towards a more curious mind, right? So, be curious about like, I don't know why I can't play this. One, let me go slower, but two, let me really be curious and be okay with that, as opposed to, I know for me when I was young, a lot of my work and practicing was about trying to obliterate that which I didn't know, or the impression that I didn't know something, right? So I always felt like I needed to have the answer. I always was trying to sort of cover up, shortcomings or weaknesses in my playing, as opposed to really being curious about them and leaning into it. So just as a general disposition, I would say, be really lean into the power of I don't know, and like what it feels like to say it out loud and to not have all the answers, and to be, sort of in the mystery, in the question, on the journey. So that would be what I would say.
I love that a lot. Thank you all so much. So we're officially out of time. But if y'all don't mind, if there's Instagram or a website that y'all want to point people to, if you don't mind putting that in the chat, just so folks can contact you there. And beyond that, I just want to say a huge thank you to Dalanie and Katie, and all the work that you've created with Classically Black Podcast. Thank you both for sharing that space with us, and for all the work you did on this. Alex, thank you so much for all that you did, and for your leadership in all of this. Beyond that, I think we've got one more session today at 11:30 if anyone's interested in that. And we'll catch everyone again real soon. Thanks again, Dalanie and Alex and Katie. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye, everybody.